This is podcast number 25. We've been talking a lot about evolution this week, and although your book doesn't specifically address all these things, I want to make sure that you understand common misconceptions that you are going to run into in thinking about evolution and talking to other people about evolution. Perhaps these things are out in the media. Perhaps these things would be on social media. Or just in talking to other people. So just to make you aware of these. And there's some good sites here that I used, evolution.berkeley.edu, Eugenie Scott, Cans and Cans of Teaching Evolution, and the National Center for Scientific Exploration. I think that is the E on here. Okay. This one is used a lot. Evolution is just a theory. But as we talked about this week, theory about it as close as you can get to the truth in science. It's after thousands of studies, hundreds to thousands of studies have been done, a theory that can explain all the results in one unifying set of explanations. That's about as good as you can get in science. There are more studies, investigations, and data to support evolution than there are that support gravity, in that there have been, evolution has been studied more than gravity has been. And most people don't realize how much strong evidence there is to support evolutionary theory. This one is not necessarily due to people who have an agenda against or for evolution. It's just a misunderstanding of the mechanisms of evolution. So it's not true that everything in evolution is due to chance, although chance plays a big role in evolution. So the mutations, which are required, you have to have variability in a population to have evolution. If everybody has the same genotype in the population, then and it never changes, then you can't have evolution because of the definition of evolution, which is a change in gene frequencies over generations. So mutations, which are an important part of all aspects of evolution, they are due to chance. And there are mechanisms of evolution, such as genetic drift, which can be due to chance. So, for example, if a person is taken out of the gene pool because they are in an accident and they die, that can be due to chance. But natural selection, another mechanism of evolution, is not due to chance, in that there are adaptations that are advantageous and selected for, and adaptations that are selected against, and some are not under heavy selection pressure at all. But it's not that everything is equal and the winners, so quote unquote, the ones who get to reproduce, are random. In the case of natural selection, it's not random, in that if you have adaptations, if you have genetic variability that gives you an advantage in that situation, that's not random. Okay, this one is exploited by people who have an agenda against evolution, and it's the idea that scientists are still studying and arguing about evolution, and therefore it's controversial and unaccepted among scientists. That's not true. There's no controversy about the existence of evolution among serious scientists. Occasionally you'll find a scientist who's not trained in evolution who will speak out against it. And some of those speak out very prominently, but they misunderstand what they're saying, and what they're saying is not consistent with scientists who understand evolution. But even among scientists who have no trouble with the idea of evolution, they will argue and discuss the details of evolution very vociferously, very intensely. So is most evolution due to drift? Is most evolution due to natural selection? Is most evolution um, due to sexual selection, which we don't talk about? You might talk about that next semester. These are all ideas that scientists talk about, but they're not arguing that evolution doesn't happen. It's just how it happens. So if you think about the economy, and the economy is hurting right now, how to fix it? What is the best way to go forward and keep everybody safe? There's lots and lots of ideas about that, and lots of arguments around how best to go forward with that. But because there's lots of people arguing about the economy, doesn't mean that the fundamental of economics are not true or not accepted by economists. So one economist may disagree with another economist, but they're not going to say that economics is no good. And so one evolutionary biologist may argue with another evolutionary biologist about the mechanisms of a particular type of evolution, but they're not going to argue about the validity of evolutionary theory. This is one you see a lot in the press. Darwin said apes turned into man. What Darwin said, he wrote a book on the origin of species, called On the Descent of Man, and I think that's the title, but that was the subject anyway, where he was talking about how humans are related to other species. And Darwin said that humans and apes had a common ancestor, and that common ancestor gave rise to humans, apes, and other primates. Some of those primates are extinct. Some of those primates are still extant. There's a lot of debate about who our early ancestors mated with as they came out of Africa, and who is in our genome. Certainly good evidence for Neanderthal DNA being in our genome. But the bottom line is Darwin didn't say that this sort of thing happened, that humans came from apes. It's just that we share a common ancestor. So this gets to this sort of thing about thinking about trees. Okay? If you think about you, it's not that your great-grandfather turned into your grandfather, who turned into your father, or turned into you. Instead, you are part of a family tree that has many individuals, and those individuals had common ancestors. So your siblings and you have common ancestors in your parents, and your cousins, your siblings, and you have a common ancestor in your grandparents, and your second cousins, and siblings, and you have a common ancestor in your great-grandparents. Okay? So that you could say that you have a common ancestor with your second cousins in your great-grandparents. In the same way, evolution is not saying that a fish turned into a salamander, turned into a cat, turned into you. It's saying that mammals and humans, which are mammals, had a common ancestor, and that amphibians, mammals, and humans had a common ancestor of four-legged creatures, vertebrates, things with backbones. Fishes, amphibians, and mammals had a common ancestor of all vertebrates, the thing that gave rise to all things with a backbone. So you wouldn't draw this sort of diagram and have anybody take you seriously, that your father turned into you. Certainly, my son wouldn't like that idea. In the same way, no one is saying a fish turned into a salamander. saying that they had a common ancestor. Okay, we'll look at this picture in the H5P questions. Okay. Another misconception, this can be among scientists, maybe not scientists trained in evolutionary biology, but equating evolution with natural selection. So natural selection is one mechanism of evolution we talked about before. Natural selection is one. It's probably the most famous because it's the most talked about, and it's how a lot of these ideas were introduced in Darwin's book. So if evolution is just a change in gene frequencies across generations, okay, and we talked about that as definition. Sometimes that's called microevolution. This could happen by genetic drift, which is not natural selection. It could happen by migration into or out of the population. It can happen by mutation. All those are valid mechanisms of evolution. Natural selection is not the only one. This one I see all the time in the media, and it's a real misunderstanding of the ideas of evolution. So there's no purpose to evolution. It just is. No organism is trying to adapt to their environment. And sometimes they say, well, these organisms will just adapt to this situation, and we don't have to worry about, say, what we're doing to the planet in terms of global warming. So you need mutations for evolution, and that part is random. And you can't try to have mutations. You can't say, okay, I'm in a bad spot here. I need to mutate. That doesn't happen. Okay. There are examples of organisms that adapt to climate change as an example of a stressor in the environment, and they can adapt rapidly, and science has documented lots of those examples, but there are also lots of examples of organisms that go extinct. So there is no effort on the part of the organism to try to adapt or try to evolve. It's just they will or they won't, and they may go extinct. And there's no purpose to it, it just is. So as Yoda says, do or do not, there is no try. Okay, another question for H5P. This is a thing that I have been guilty about early in my career, and that is thinking that everything you see on an organism is an adaptation. So you come up with a little story about how this trait gives the organism an advantage, and therefore it was selected for in some part of this organism's evolutionary history. And this happens a lot in non-scientists too. So every trait does not have to be an adaptation to local conditions, and a trait can be a leftover from some part of your evolutionary history. So your blood is red, human blood is red. Not all things that have blood have red blood, but humans do. It just happens to be that way. There's no evolutionary advantage by being red versus blue versus yellow. It just is. It has to do with the color of the iron-containing group that is part of the protein hemoglobin. Another example is somebody might have a big nose, and it's not that they have a big nose because that gave them an advantage in smelling out a certain situation. They got a big nose because their parents have a big nose, or somebody in their recent history gave them the genes for a big nose. It has nothing to do with an advantage or disadvantage in that situation. So everything doesn't have to be an adaptation. Sometimes it's a constraint in that you have to have a backbone and perhaps the way that those bones are stacked on top of each other may give pain, but you can't live without a backbone. So your evolutionary history gave you a backbone, even though it's not necessarily the perfect structure. I'll touch on that again. So everything doesn't need to be an adaptation when you're looking at the phenotype of an organism. I used to work on sharks. I was actually on a shark show back in the late 90s, and I ran into this a lot when I did work on sharks. I don't work on sharks anymore. People would say things like sharks are highly evolved killers, or maybe the most highly evolved killers. You can't say anything about quality or quantity of evolution. It just is. So things aren't more evolved or less evolved or highly evolved or not evolved, because those things mean that evolution would have some kind of goal. And evolution doesn't have any goal. It just is. If natural selection produces a structure that works in a particular situation, there won't be any pressure, there won't be any advantage to change that structure. So sharks have had this basic shape for hundreds of millions of years. If you look at fossil sharks, they have this basic shape. And so in that sense, you could say evolution has not changed much over hundreds of millions of years for sharks, and therefore they haven't evolved much. They are less evolved. So the only time when you can really use this term more evolved or less evolved is in an experimental situation. So there are people studying evolution experimentally in a lab using organisms that have really short generation times, like on the order of 20 minutes or something like that. And over a career, there are examples of people studying E. coli, for example, that have studied 50,000 generations. And those people can talk about more evolved or less evolved lines of E. coli as a way of having a shortcut, a way of talking about generation 1 versus generation 40,000. But in this sense, where you're trying to say that an organism is well adapted for a particular trait, that's baloney. You don't want to say that. Okay. This one, biological complexity argues for intelligent design. This comes from religious organizations who don't agree with the idea of evolution, and instead would rather use a supernatural explanation for how organisms came to be the way they are. And say a common argument from this political and religious organizations that are interested in this point of view is saying that there are structures that are too complex to exist, like a human eye. And therefore they must have been placed on this earth by God, some supernatural force. But even in complicated structures like eyes in humans, these exist as much simpler intermediate structures in an evolutionary related ancestors. So in something as simple as a one-celled paramecium, this is a eukaryotic cell, but it's one cell. They have spots that are sensitive to light, and those spots help them find light, and they can photosynthesize, and therefore it gives that organism an advantage, and therefore they're selected for. In Insects, they have ommatidia, which are individual light-sensing cells all collected into a compound eye, and they are very sensitive to movement, and so they're selected for so that insects can avoid predators. In vertebrates, you have a protein crystal in your eye that focuses light and allows for higher resolution imaging, and that gives those organisms an advantage because they have better vision in that case. So these are different steps toward making an eye, and each one gives a selective advantage, and so you don't have to instantly pop out with a human eye in evolution. There are also examples of I thought I had a picture in here. Sorry, I don't. There are examples of a change in just one gene that can cause an eye to appear. So there are these things called rhinoceros beetles, horn beetles. They're large. They're about 3 inches long, and they have these big ornamental horns that come off the front of the beetle. And scientists, they're studying how the genes that control these ornaments, because they're very adaptable from one generation to the next. They don't always look the same. They're looking at the genes that control these ornaments. They knocked out one of those genes so that the beetle couldn't make that thing anymore. And instead, what showed up instead of a horn was an eye. And this beetle then had 3 eyes, just like the three-eyed raven in Game of Thrones, and all 3 eyes worked. So they were wired up to the brain. They could detect light, and they could send impulses back. And that was just by changing one gene. So it's not that complex structures like an eye always involve many steps in terms of mutations before you get something like that. That's the eye showing up in the beetle was an example of that. But even if they do occur in many steps, each step would give that organism an advantage and would be selected for, and you can build up a series of events that would result in an eye. Okay. Another argument along those same idea concerns metabolic pathways. So we're going to talk about metabolic pathways soon. And metabolic pathways, as you will see, are complex. They have many different parts, and you're going to memorize some of those parts, and you're not going to like it because there's lots of different parts. So the question is, how could this thing have evolved? If you've got to go through 15 steps before you get the thing that you want, how could that have evolved? How could all of those genes mutate at the same time? They don't have to mutate at the same time. So if we think about glycolysis, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will talk about soon, the idea in glycolysis is to break down glucose, sugar, and use it to create an energy molecule called ATP. Again, we're going to talk about that soon. So if an organism that can convert glucose to its first thing, or an organism that can use glucose and make ATP, has an advantage has an advantage over other organisms in the population that cannot use glucose for ATP. And so there's going to be competition in a population for this glucose because it gives them energy. And if a mutation shows up where now an organism can either use glucose or glucose 6-phosphate, which is a modification of glucose, they can use either one of these. Those organisms have a big advantage because they can use this or this, and so they're not just dependent on this, and they will have an advantage. And then another mutation happens where they could use this, this, or this, and those have an advantage over organisms that can only use 2 or organisms that can only use 1, and therefore it's favored. And as you'll see soon, these are the first 3 steps in the breakdown of glucose. So these are how these pathways can evolve. And this sort of change has actually been observed by humans in those experimental systems that I was talking about, where they watch E. coli evolve over 50,000 generations, and they've seen biochemical pathways evolve in just this way. That has been seen in the lab. So we know that this can occur. We didn't talk about the laws of thermodynamics from Newton, but the second law of thermodynamics states that all things, all reactions result in an increase in entropy overall. And entropy is disorder. And if things get more disordered or more complicated, how is it that you ever build a body or a cell which is less disordered, less complicated? So it's not just molecules floating all around the place. It's molecules in a certain area that have a certain structure. They don't have any structure possible. They have a certain structure. In those systems, you maintain the second law of thermodynamics by increasing entropy even more in a coupled reaction. So maybe temporarily I need to put these 2 things together, but in a coupled reaction I'm going to release 2 things apart from each other. It releases a ton of entropy, and so that overall I will have a net increase in entropy. And since I'm not going to talk much more about that, since we didn't talk about thermodynamics yet. Okay. This one is interesting because I study proteins, and proteins are too improbable. The chance of putting 100 amino acids together would be 1 out of 20. There's 20 amino acids, and then you put 100 in the right order. That's to the 1 out of 20 to the 100th power. That would be a very, very small number, and so it would be improbable. But that's just bad math and bad biochemistry. Okay, I haven't rewritten this slide since the last time I taught this with 175 people, but there's 39 people in this class. Everybody in this class has a birthday. That birthday falls on one of the days of the year, and so by the logic of this statement, your birthdays, the chance that you have these birthdays are 1 out of 365, 1 out of the days of the year, to the 39th power. And that would be a huge number. But you all do have your birthdays, right? So it's just, it's not a mathematically correct way of thinking about this problem. So protein amino acids are put together randomly. Then they're acted on by selection, like organisms are acted on by selection. And sequences that fold into shapes that do a particular job are selected for, and the ones that fold into shapes that don't do a particular job are selected against. And we know we can subject proteins to selection. I told you the example of the proteins that had directed evolution, where they were selected to be able to work under conditions of laundry, high temperature and high amount of soap. And that was done in the lab, so we know that proteins can evolve and that you can select for particular jobs for proteins to do. This one is an interesting one, and it's more about how humans think about numbers. So no one has ever observed a fish evolved into a frog, so that things that live in water eventually moved onto land, and this transition from fish to frog was part of that, is how we describe that transition to land. So where are all the fossils that show this fish evolving into a frog? Well, transitional fossils do exist for fish evolving into a frog. This one is called Tiktaalik. This guy right here is a model of what this organism looked like. But you could extend this argument to any sort of transition you're thinking about. Okay, where are the transitional fossils? By the way, Neil Shubin is the scientist who discovered this transitional fossil. I got to talk to him about it, and he said the way that you look for these sorts of transitions is you say, okay, if we're correct about our assumptions about when things happen, how much how many years ago in geological history, then you look for rocks that are that old. So if this transition happened, I don't know, 480 million years ago, I don't actually know when the transition happened, you look for rocks that are that old, and then you look for where are those rocks at the surface of the earth, so I can go look for those rocks, and then you go to that place and you start digging. And that's what he did, and that's where he found this fossil that has characteristics like an amphibian and also characteristics like a fish. So it's a transitional fossil. Okay, but if you understand geological time, no one would expect this sort of a change. Okay, the number of changes that are involved from going from this to happen in any person's lifetime. This person's lifetime is a very small amount in terms of geological time. And even if all humans were looking for this change and we could have all of human recorded history, that wouldn't be enough time. So to give you an idea of how much time has happened, or just how to deal with these numbers. So if it's hundreds of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, most people don't have an idea of what a million is, even in their head. So if you take $1 out of your wallet, if you got a wallet, or the back of your phone, if you don't use a wallet, and you flatten out your dollar, and you stack a million of those on top of each other, that's actually about a third of the height of the Empire State Building. It's about 350 feet tall. If you have a 2-story house, your house is about 30 feet tall. So that stack of $1 million bills would be 10 houses, 10 houses high. It's much more than people think, and that's 1 million, not 480 million. So people are just not used to, in their everyday life, thinking in terms of a million, or a billion, or 10 million, or 100 million. And so it's very hard to think about how much time that is, and how much change could happen in that time. Here's another example to give you an idea of that you don't necessarily need to see something in order for it to be true. So, Pluto. It was marked down as not a planet, and now maybe be coming back as a planet. I don't know. I haven't followed that recently, but it takes almost 250 years for Pluto to go around the sun. It was discovered in 1930. That was the first time Pluto was discovered with telescopes. So literally, it hasn't been 250 years since Pluto was discovered, and so that means that no human has ever seen Pluto go all the way around the sun. But there's no one I know that doubts that Pluto does go all the way around the sun. So since 1930, if you're tracking Pluto's orbit, it's going around in an ellipse like other orbits, and you wouldn't expect that all of a sudden it's going to take a right turn, or all of a sudden it started to go backwards. So you don't have to observe the entirety of something happening in order to know that this is true, or it's reasonable, most reasonable explanation for it to be true. Okay, more questions.